Today, we're looking at a challenging issue, the resurgence of anti-Semitism, which you know is happening globally, but particularly in the United States. And we're delighted that we have our eminent guest, Holly Huffnagle, who, as Jeremy said, is AJC's Director for Combating Antisemitism, the longest hatred. And we are unfortunately seeing its resurgence, especially in the United States, which Holly is going to address today. She's going to tell us why, to what extent, and hopefully what to do about it. I should also say that on this occasion, with another distinguished AJC guest of honor talking to us, how much we value the association with our partners at the American Jewish Committee. We're always delighted to host their outstanding professionals and very grateful they do so willingly and share with us their expertise and advice. With that, Holly, I handball the screen to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I want to thank AIJAC for hosting me, to Jeremy for the invitation. And as he mentioned, I first met him several years ago when I was at the US Department of State, and he's a true friend. And I do look forward to the day when we can be in person again. So before I begin today, I wanted to share something about the American Jewish Committee, about AJC. We have 24 regional offices in the US, 12 overseas posts, 13 actually coming up. We're opening up an office in the UAE. And we have 37 association agreements with Jewish organizations and communities around the world. But do you know the very first agreement AJC ever made, number one of the now 37 agreements, was with Australia, Israel, and Jewish Affairs Council. So our longstanding partnership with AIJAC remains of utmost importance and continues to be a real model of friendship and cooperation. So I thank you. As many of you are aware, we witnessed a new upsurge in global anti-Semitism really beginning in the early 2000s. And I wanted to set the stage before I begin speaking about the United States, what's happening, and AJC's recent State of Antisemitism in America report. And this new global upsurge in anti-Semitism really began again in the early 2000s, especially in Europe and in Western Europe in particular. And there were several lessons that we learned from what happened and what is still happening, I should say, in Europe, which are incredibly relevant as we are now seeing rising anti-Semitism, at least consistently over the last 5 years in the United States. So we know the importance of being aware of the problem early and not denying it. We know how critical it is to identify the different sources and speak out unambiguously, even if it's not easy. And this was something we had to do with the anti-Semitic attacks we've witnessed in Brooklyn, New York, also in Jersey City, in Muncie, New York. Even though the perpetrators, did not come from far-right white supremacist sources, which are often easier to call out. We know the importance of promoting national cohesion around the issue, saying that anti-Semitism is a societal issue for all Americans. It's not just an issue for government or law enforcement or just the Jewish community. It's an issue for everyone. It's really about our democracy and our democratic values. And we also have learned and know that the efforts must be sustained, that there are no quick, easy fixes, and making statements, having conferences, even placing guards in front of synagogues, which are all very important. They really are band-aids over the larger problem. So these were some of the lessons that we were learning from Europe, seeing the rise in Europe even before it came to the US. But we also learned a more practical lesson from Europe, and that's survey data. And in 2012 and again in 2018, the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, also called colloquially the FRA, conducted surveys on European Jews and their perceptions of and experiences with anti-Semitism. Now, the EU understood there was a problem and wanted to find out, what was going on. Now, here in the United States, American Jews have been surveyed about many things. There have been many surveys done on American Jews. American Jews have answered many surveys. So AJC assumed that American Jews had at some point been surveyed solely about their perceptions of anti-Semitism. But as of 2019, they really had not been. So 1 year after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history, AJC conducted that survey. And the results were eye-opening. We knew that Pittsburgh was a wake-up call for American Jews to rising levels of anti-Semitism in the United States. But this year, in 2020, 2 years after the Pittsburgh attack, we asked a different question. Was Pittsburgh a wake-up call for all Americans? What does the general public think about anti-Semitism? Are they aware of the increase? Do they even know what anti-Semitism is? We asked that question. You see, we wanted to be able to ascertain both how American Jews were feeling about anti-Semitism in America, simultaneously with what the US general public knew. To understand, is there a gap? What are we missing? And the result of those questions was this first of its kind report, of which I will now highlight the findings with you. So bear with me as I share my screen and pull up the slides. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. Before we start sharing the highlights, one of the questions that we often get is, why is anti-Semitism rising? Now, there are really no comprehensive full list of every reason why, but there are some common themes. And I think it's important to know that these themes exist simultaneously, they're happening at once, and that really does contribute to rising levels of anti-Semitism in the United States. So the spike in anti-Semitism is really taking place, and this is looking probably at the last 10 years, look at the last decade, but the real increase has been in the last 5 years in the US. It's taking place in the context of rising economic uncertainty. We know throughout history, Jews have been blamed for economic woes, a lack of confidence in our democracy. And this is not unique to the United States. This is, other liberal democracies around the world which are facing pressure, citizens' lack of trust in their government to lead. And unfortunately, Jews are often blamed in this space. A third reason for the rise is an increased emphasis on race and national identity. Sorry about that. And this has been exacerbated, unfortunately, by political leaders. We've had an increase in white nationalist and white supremacist groups in the United States in recent years, really came to a head in the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally that we had in August of 2017, unfortunately. A fourth reason for the rise is, again, unfortunately, a fading legacy of the Holocaust. There have been several surveys that have been done. We actually asked some of these questions in ours of Americans' understanding of the Holocaust, and especially amongst younger Americans, that knowledge is on the steady decline. And a recent claims conference survey actually revealed that American millennials and Gen Z, so even younger respondents, one of the most startling statistics was that 11% believe that Jews caused the Holocaust. And so there is this lack of awareness, there is a lack of understanding where unchecked anti-Semitism can lead. And so this is a factor in rising anti-Semitism in the US. A fifth reason is a deepening polarization. I could put a period right there. It's just our society is so polarized in general, but to be more, again, across political spectrum, across the religious spectrum, but to be a little bit more specific, a deepening polarization between the political left and the political right of with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and Jews again being targeted for Israeli policies or being charged with dual loyalty, et cetera, is another contributing factor. A sixth factor is the internet and social media. I'm thankful for the internet for connecting us today. Of course, I wish I was with you in person. But in the last 10 years, especially with the rise of social media platforms, there has been an uptick in anti-Semitic content, especially in the form of conspiracy theories. The internet has really served as a launching pad for conspiracy theories and lies. Lies spread 6 times faster than truth. There's no fact checkers, there's no gatekeepers. We know this. We're seeing this daily. There's been some improvement with social media companies, which I can speak about, but I think it was pretty late in the day for some of those decisions. And unfortunately, Jews have been targeted, and there's been real life consequences as well. And then the seventh is there's more sources. And this is an interesting point. I think there is a lack of awareness amongst Americans. They understand far right white supremacist sources. They understand hatred toward Jews, but they don't understand that anti-Semitism really comes from other places as well. And I have a kind of a screen grab here of about 5 different incidents within the past year. Actually, the Jersey City shooting, which is in my upper left corner, might be reversed for you, which the perpetrators were from the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. So this was a little over a year ago. We just commemorated that 1-year mark last week. That's an example of anti-Semitism coming from a religious extremist source, not necessarily white supremacy. On the opposite corner, there's a march. On the upper corner, there's a protest march happening. This was in Washington, D.C., which is where I am now. And the protesters, it was a racial justice protest, which we had a lot in America, and many of them was an important topic to be addressing. But this march in particular, they were shouting, Israel, we know you murdered children, or you murdered children too. Again, this false equivalence between American perceived police brutality and connecting it with Israel and the treatment of Palestinians, and invoking the anti-Semitic blood libel with that accusation. So this is an example, of anti-Semitism coming from the left, from the far left. We've seen anti-Semitism in the form of Holocaust denial and distortion, especially distortion in this lower corner with the mask and the Star of David in front of one of the train cars, and this iconic kind of Holocaust imagery. Inappropriate invocation of the Holocaust has happened actually in several American cities during these COVID-19 restrictions happening. Another example is this was also at a COVID-19 kind of protest. The sign, it's an example of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, again mixed with some kind of older traditional forms of anti-Semitism, with the juxtaposition of a rat over the Israeli flag. And you can see this as the real plague. And then this final picture at the very bottom, this was just a few days ago. And for those, if any of you are following the news, we've actually had some significant attacks just in the first days of Hanukkah. And this, on the very first night of Hanukkah, the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, Idaho, was vandalized with far right, neo-Nazi, white supremacist from that source with this Nazi swastika on the diary of Anne Frank. And so just from this screen grab, and when I talk about complexity of anti-Semitism, you see the religious extremism, you see the far left, you see Holocaust distortion and denial, you see anti-Israel anti-Semitism, and you see the far right. And this is all happening at once. And it's one of the reasons why anti-Semitism in America and in other countries as well is so challenging to combat. So that's the context that we were beginning to ask our survey, wanting to understand how American Jews are feeling about what's happening. And I won't get into too much detail with the methodology, but we partnered with a public opinion research firm called SSRS, which does major surveys for CNN, ESPN, a reputable company. The one thing I'll point out was our sample size. We wanted to have 1,000 American Jews. We had over 1,300, which was the largest sample of American Jews ever conducted by a Jewish organization in the U.S. in history. So we're proud of that number and confident in the survey results. So here's some top lines that I'll share for the next few minutes, and then we can do a little bit of deeper dive maybe in the question and answer session. So nearly 9 in 10 American Jews believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in the US today. And 37% believe it's a very serious problem. So that was the first top line, something is awry. 82% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years, with 43% saying it's increased a lot. More than 1 in 3, 37% of American Jews have actually been targeted by anti-Semitism, either online or offline, in the last 5 years. So 1 in 3 American Jews have been the target of anti-Semitism. Now, 22% of American Jews, they were targeted online. So 37%, overall verbal attacks, physical attacks. The physical attacks were quite small at 3%, most verbal and then most online as well. So 22% were attacked online. And for the first time, we actually asked, we did not do this in 2019 in our first survey, but in 2020, we asked about American Jews' experiences on social media. And of course, this is American Jewish adults. So if we had surveyed Jews under 18, we probably would have had a little bit of a different answer, maybe with TikTok, but it's reflecting where American Jews are, like which platforms they're using, of course, but 62% experience anti-Semitism on Facebook, 33% on Twitter, 12% on Instagram, and 10% on YouTube. The other important finding, though, with this section in particular was we asked American Jews if they reported it. Did they, they're receiving this vitriol? Did they report it? Did it violate standards? And if they reported it, did they get a response? 46% of American Jews did not get a response to their report. So again, when AJC, we work with different tech companies on pushing back against anti-Semitism on their platforms. This is an important data point. We can actually look and see, okay, the response rate of Facebook was X, the response rate of Twitter was Y. What's happening? Where is that disconnect? That was also really, really helpful data. We found that 1 in 4 American Jews have avoided publicly wearing, carrying, or displaying things that might help people identify them as Jews over the past 2 years. So 25% of American Jews have avoided showing that they were Jewish. They've hid their identity, which, in America, which is, I think been one of the best places actually for for Jews in the diaspora. This was a real shock to many people in our organization that this was the reality right now. Another important aspect of this survey in particular was we were able to, for the first time, gather trend data. So we did this survey in 2019. We asked the same questions and some more, but we asked the same questions in 2020. So for the first time, we're able to see the difference. And really, having a statistic on its own is interesting, but it's not really helpful unless you can compare it with something. And so we even asked ourselves, I remember this conversation back last summer, we said, do you think there's going to be different answers in 2020? And it's only a year's gone by, but we convinced ourselves that 2020 was a very different year with the antisemitism we saw during the pandemic, even during some of the protest movements, unfortunately, this summer, our election. So we figured that 2020 was enough enough had happened to get some different results. And some of the results were the exact same, but some of them were different. And I wanted to share this one with you. So in answer to the question, do you ever avoid certain places, events, or situations out of your concern for your safety as a Jew? In 2019, 1 in 4, 25% of American Jews said yes. That number jumped to almost 1 in 3 in 2020. 31% have avoided certain places out of their concern for their safety as someone who is Jewish. So this is also a little disconcerting. One question that we also often get is, are American Jews just anxious? Are they fearful? Or are they overly sensitive? That's another one. Are overly sensitive? And because do their feelings align with the data? And this is more of our non-Jews asking these questions. And we can definitively say, actually, American Jews' perceptions about anti-Semitism does align with the data. And here's an example. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our FBI puts out a hate crime statistic report every year. They do it in November for the year before. So 2019 was just released a few weeks ago. And in 2019, 60.2% of all religious bias crimes in America targeted Jews, who make up 2%, even a little bit less than 2% of the American population. So this number is up from 56.9% in 2018. So we've seen that increase again. The trend data is helpful here too. You can compare the Jewish victims of hate crimes, anti-Jewish incidents between 2019 and 2018 to again see how anti-Semitism is rising in the US. So American Jews' perceptions aligns with the data. I'm going to get to my final big takeaway from the survey. And that's the comparison data between American Jews and the general public. So in answer to the question, is anti-Semitism a problem in America today? 88% of American Jews said yes, 63% of Americans said yes. I think the more disconcerting number is down here, where 1 in 3 Americans actually said no. Anti-Semitism is not a problem in the US. Equally, maybe even a little bit more divergent is about the amount of anti-Semitism in America, if it's increased or if it's decreased. And if you look at this 43% number, general public said 43% said it increased. But what that means is, it means that 57% didn't think it increased. 57% either thought that it stayed the same or that it decreased. So they're not aware, there's a lack of awareness, even though the FBI has consistently showed this increase over each year since really 2015, if not before. There's other data out there that's actually showing that right now we're almost at a 4-decade high of anti-Semitic incidents. So there is this lack of awareness amongst the general public. This is one of maybe the most interesting points that came out of our general public survey, and it was a question that we kind of inserted, toward the end, but put it right at the beginning. We wanted to know if Americans even knew what anti-Semitism is. And so the very first question of our survey was, how familiar are you with the term anti-Semitism? And this is the results. We had nearly half, 46% of Americans really not familiar with the term. And so 21% had actually never heard the term before, 25% had heard of it, but they weren't sure what it meant. Now, we did explain, we said, anti-Semitism, which is hostility towards Jews, and then we asked the next question. So everyone that participated in the survey, they answered all the questions related to anti-Semitism in America. But the very first question was this, and it connects to another significant finding. We asked if a Jewish person or organization considered a statement or idea to be anti-Semitic, would that make you more or less likely to consider it anti-Semitic? And I think we thought more people might be more likely. Oh, someone who's Jewish talks about the persecution against them, or anti-Jewish racism or Jewish hatred, like what it means. You would consider their point of view. We do that with African Americans, with racism. We do it with women, with misogyny. We do it with Muslims, with Islamophobia. So these are the kind of questions. But no, we found that 65% said it wouldn't make a difference. Now, we don't know if that's necessarily a negative thing. Maybe they already know what anti-Semitism is. But it does make us think that how important it is for non-Jews and non-Jewish organizations to be explaining to Americans, what is anti-Semitism and why is it important that they fight it. The last point, and I'm going to wind down here, Jeremy, because I'm past my 20 minutes, but a nice highlight, if you will, from the survey data were questions, was this question in particular, but the umbrella category we had, and we have several more questions on this, so I do encourage you to actually look at the report and see all of the questions that we asked. But was anti-Semitism in connection, to Israel? And one question that we asked was if Americans and American Jews consider the statement, Israel has no right to exist, to be anti-Semitic. And that statement, Israel has no right to exist, which again is a key tenet, I would say, at least of anti-Zionism. 85% of American Jews said yes, which we expected. But what we didn't expect, and which was like pleasantly surprising in a good way, was that 74% of the US general public agreed. So we have 3/4 of Americans also agreeing with this statement, which I think really does add to when we're advocating for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. There is an example that talks about declaring that, saying that Israel is a racist endeavor, doesn't have a right to exist, can be anti-Semitic. And we're showing here that this is not a Jewish definition. This is a universal definition. And this is an example of non-Jews agreeing with that statement. We asked a few other questions again about Jewish money, dual loyalty, some of these other tropes. That wasn't as recognized. Americans did not see that as recognizably anti-Semitic as they did with the first one, Israel's no right to exist, and you can see the data here. So where do we go from here? I mentioned the defining anti-Semitism aspect, the education aspect. So this is really where AJC is going to take this data in the next couple of years and really try to transform how Americans see anti-Semitism, understand anti-Semitism, and especially, like, why should they care about it? And I think that's so important to put it in a context of these other societal issues that we're facing. Whether it be with our democracy, with even a lack of government or transparency or tech transparency, media literacy. Just there's so many other issues that are connected to anti-Semitism that we really want to kind of bring into the conversation with the general public. So that goes with building coalitions as well, having non-Jews, our intergroup, interethnic partners be that voice for us. And the last point I'll mention, and then I'll end, is with the data and reporting. 76% of American Jews who experienced an anti-Semitic attack did not report it. 76% did not report it. So for a couple of reasons. One, they didn't think that it warranted reporting. It wasn't a big enough deal. That speaks to the normalization of the problem. Anti-Semitism becoming normalized if you don't feel like it's a big enough deal to report it. Or they didn't feel like law enforcement would do anything about it. So that's the resignation in the fight when it's not being taken seriously enough. So this is really where a lot of our efforts will go in the next few months and into next year is better data collection, better reporting. We're lobbying Congress on some bills that will help law enforcement with anti-Semitic hate crime reporting. So couple of key things, how we're going to combat it, what we're going to be doing about it. I can go into more detail maybe in the question and answer session. So there's the link to the report, and I highly encourage a deeper dive because I hit about 10 highlights and there's at least 40 or 50 questions in there. So Jeremy, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen as well, and we can take some questions.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to get through with just that presentation. Just to explain the process, if you have a question and you're part of the Zoom meeting, please use the raise hand function. I think everybody here has been in one of our seminars before, but if you open your participants list, there should be a button to raise hand, or on the bottom of your screen, raise hand on a desktop or a laptop, and it might be somewhere else on the iPad, but please look for that function. You could also ask a question in chat. And I've actually had quite a few questions emailed that have come through, and they're on the Facebook page. So we have no shortage of questions already. But I would like to invite Dr. Colin Rubenstein to ask the first question. Please, Colin.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks very much for that very comprehensive, informative overview, Holly. Just taking up some of your last remarks about the IRA definition. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that many in the anti-Zionist left are working with a worldview in which the main thing to say about anti-Semitism is that accusations of anti-Semitism are used to silence critics of Israel. In other words, anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence critics. And many not only dismiss the reality of contemporary anti-Semitism as a result of this view, but seem to argue that any comment which even mentions Israel as Zionism is by definition not anti-Semitic. I mean, this clearly is a dangerous trend, and one, I'd like to ask you how you fight back against this. And related, double-barrel question, given that many on the left of politics insist that anti-Semitism is an exclusively right-wing phenomenon, and those on the left are by definition anti-racist and therefore free of anti-Semitism. Now, this is a dangerous trend as well. And what can be done about this? And the final point is on the IRA definition. How important do you think it is to get the widespread adoption of this definition in the battle against these trends? And you'll be well aware that there's been a concerted effort to delegitimize the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, including by falsely claiming it's an attempt to silence any criticism of Israel. I'm sure you saw The Guardian publish such a letter by over 100 Palestinian and Arab academics and journalists recently. So how can concerns over the IRA definition be overcome and its acceptance become more widespread? And in this mix, of course, you haven't mentioned it, but you're well aware of it, of course, is the Islamist strand of anti-Semitism as well. You may care to comment on. Yeah,
Colin, you just in a couple of minutes summarized my the conversations I think I have on a daily basis. To start, we know that American Jews and our allies know that anti-Semitism doesn't just come from the far right. We can, look even back to the Soviet Union and before, with the Zionism and racism campaigns and the anti-Jewish purges, which under the guise of Zionism targeted Jews. And there is a long history, unfortunately, of anti-Semitism on the left and on the far left. I think there's a lack of awareness about that because, as you said, they advocate on the platform of anti-racism, but somehow they let every other minority to define the persecution against them, except Jews, which again, that double standard, and Islamist anti-Semitism and extremism. Exactly, like we have to look at these different sources, and we have to be swivel-headed about it. We can't just focus just on one and then lose sight of the other. The IHRA definition, when we go back to why a working definition was even needed, and this again goes back to that early 2000s when there was that upsurge in anti-Semitism. There didn't used to be a need for a definition because there was an understanding of what anti-Semitism really, what it was. It kind of had that traditional xenophobic, maybe rooted in Christian anti-Judaism sources, maybe the conspiracy theories that were part of Protocols of Elders of Zion, from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But in the early 2000s, Jews were starting to be attacked as agents of Israel. Or Jewish sites were being vandalized, but it was called political actions or, anti-Israel actions. There was some protests where people would be shouting "slaughter the Jews," and it was called intercommunal tensions, not anti-Semitism. Synagogues were firebombed. Jewish houses of worship, not in Europe, were firebombed for the actions of a nation state, Israel, and it was not called anti-Semitism. They might have been criminalized for arson, so there was a problem. There was a connection between what was happening in Israel and the targeting of Jews, and there was that need for that definition to bring in examples, again, of in context. It's not always, it's these, I always say that these 11 examples that are part of the IHRA definition, they're not ipso facto anti-Semitism. And even if they are, you don't necessarily need to say that. It's helping understand what anti-Semitism is. That word can be used as a bludgeon. I agree that it's actually been I think it's been a little bit overused, and that's some of the reason why we're getting this pushback. So we have to be really careful and judicious when we call someone an anti-Semite or we say something is anti-Semitic. But that was why the definition was created, was because you were having Jews being targeted and even their right to self-determination being denied, and it wasn't perceived as anti-Semitism. And so the need for the definition and that understanding is huge. And I always, the critics on the left are saying that this is a Jewish definition, or that it's a tool of the Israeli government, or that it's an Israeli government definition. And that was not the case. It was created by an apolitical body of experts, of policymakers. And the IHRA is a non-Jewish body. It's an intergovernmental body of at the time, 31 member states that adopted it in 2016. And most of the governments in Europe and around the world that are using it and have adopted it, it's not, they aren't Jewish. So I always try to kind of tease that out and mention that they're using it as an educational tool and as a resource. It's not meant to, silence free speech. It's not meant to say that Palestinian human rights activists don't have a voice. I do think that the IHRA definition has been misused, but my argument is a useful tool should not go all of a sudden unused because there's a chance that it could be misused. We know now that it's helped so much in so many different spaces in understanding what anti-Semitism is. And that's why we need to kind of push it forward. Now, when it comes to adoptions, I'll kind of at least stop here. When it comes to these adoptions, there's been some concern that this might be virtue signaling, right? That people are adopting it and there's no real outcome. From our perspective, and AJC is encouraging, we're actually encouraging cities across the United States now to endorse the definition, not necessarily through legislation, but through resolution. Again, the definition is not legally binding, so it's not meant to have a legally binding status, but we want it used. We want Americans to know that it's there, to use, to look at it, to reference it, to be educated about it. And so at the end of the day, if the definition becomes politicized and it becomes a political battle and that's not as important to the adoption as it is to the, for me, from my perspective, for its use. And that's what I want it used by Americans and by, you know, organizations and entities all over the world. So excellent question, Colin. The conversation on this will go on.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Anthony Cohen to ask the next question, please.
Oh, we can't hear you, Anthony. Anthony, could you unmute yourself? Sorry.
No, Anthony, you're
Is that better?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comments. Look, Holly, Jews are only 0.02 of 1% of the world population, but we're out there. 22% of Nobel Prizes. Just looking at the stats, most people in the world have never had any contact with, spoken to any Jew whatsoever. But it doesn't seem to make much difference. Yeah, I mean, you've got your Pfizer and Moderna companies run by Jews. The Jews, I think, run the scientific programs involved there. You've got Hollywood. I mean, we're business, you know, the social media, we are out there. And so when a problem occurs, you know, we're small in number and we can be blamed. And one of the things that I've learned through this COVID, I mean, we live in Australia, which is an island country. We're separated. We've done, it's a modern country. We've probably done better than anyone else. But here, the leaders, many of the leaders of our states have so terrified the population of what's going on. I can only picture what went on in Hitler's time when it was really bad times for people.
Sorry, Anthony, I must ask you to ask your question, please.
Well, the question really is that I don't think we're going to the average person in the street, which is what you're appealing to. Is that right? I mean, you're making these definitions and wanting governments to appeal by, but the person in the street is doing their own blaming of their own volition. And, you know, I don't know, I admire what you're doing, but do you really think it can make a difference to the person in the street?
I hope so. No, it's a good question. It's a valid question. I think if we look at categories of Americans, and again, this is a massive generalization, but we have our allies. We have, you know, those who are working with us, who know what anti-Semitism is, who are on board, and we don't need to necessarily convince them that anti-Semitism is a problem, that it's a societal issue. We have them. We have, of course, the anti-Semites, the people that are on the fringe platforms that have entered into the mainstream, who are, you know, vehement neo-Nazis. I don't think we're going to convince them either. We can try. There's been some incredible redemption stories actually here in the US. For example, Derek Black, the godson of David Duke, of the Klan head, and he is now an advocate actually for Jewish issues, for combating anti-Semitism. And he was supposed to be leading the white nationalist movement. But for the most part, we're not going to get them either. But there is that middle group, the on the fringe, the people who, the average person on the street. And you're right that I think that even many Americans haven't met Jews, even though there are Jews here and there is a little bit more awareness. I think what it kind of comes down to and what we want to do is teach or either re-educate or re-emphasize like human decency. And I think at AJC, we go back to this example in Billings, Montana in the 90s when there was a Jewish family that had a menorah in the window, and an anti-Semite, basically a neo-Nazi, drove by and threw a rock at the window and it almost killed a child that was sleeping. And the town, which again, doesn't really, you know, the town, which was your average Joes on the street, There was a menorah was printed in the newspaper, and the town cut out those menorahs, and they all put it on their, not all, but majority put on their own windows. And it was just like a resounding, solidarity with this Jewish family, that the hate doesn't belong here, that, the hater doesn't belong here. And I think, even if it's not specifically, of course, we combat anti-Semitism at AJC, but we really are, it's like this, the human rights and human dignity of all people. And if we can somehow encourage, whether it be through these campaigns, whether it be through our mayors, whether it be through educational programs or various initiatives to kind of recapture that, communal response, that's a win, even if we might not educate every single Joe on the street. So that's our goal. But I do understand the reality and your perspective. Absolutely.
Thank you. Our next question goes to Kyle Orton. Welcome to Australia, Kyle, and welcome to our seminar. Kyle, please.
Thanks for having me. Your data suggested that there's a reticence in listening to Jews about the definition of the prejudice against them, in a way that doesn't seem to be true of other communities. And I was just wondering if you knew why that was.
I have anecdotal evidence. Our survey, and this is a weakness, I think, in surveys, you ask a question and then you get the results and you wish you had a follow-up. So, we asked this question, would you listen, or if someone who was Jewish or a Jewish organization said something was anti-Semitic, would that make you more likely, less likely, or no difference to consider it anti-Semitic? And I think that no difference category, or that less likely category, really surprised us. But we didn't have a follow-up question that said, why not? So we don't actually know why. We can assume that maybe, I'm hopeful that some people already know what it is, to be honest. But I do think it has something to say that there is this uncertainty about having Jews be able to define the prejudice against them. And I don't know if that has connected to this idea that I think is within part of American society, that maybe American Jews are oversensitive to anti-Semitism, or is that connection that they're going to make maybe to Israel, and there's some politics there as a reason why. But I don't actually, from the survey itself, I don't have those answers yet. We can see anecdotally, though, that American Jews aren't necessarily listened to when it comes to defining anti-Semitism. And this is especially with the IRA definition, because 90% of the community is very want that definition passed and used. And there's just a lot of unfortunate pushback from it, especially because of the Israel examples. Excellent question.
Thank you. The next question is for Sharon Mittelman. Sharon.
Hi, Holly. Thanks so much. President Trump received a lot of criticism for a dog whistling to white supremacists, but he also had an executive order on combating anti-Semitism. So what role do you think the Trump presidency played in increasing anti-Semitism? And at the same time, how do you think a Biden presidency will respond to the issue of anti-Semitism?
Such a good question. We're living in it right now. Deborah Lipstadt, the historian, Holocaust historian, actually has a good line about how anti-Semitism is kind of spread, and she kind of focuses on like different groups, and one of her kind of groups is either the dinner party anti-Semite or the anti-Semitic enabler, where this person's not anti-Semitic, but will maybe inadvertently pass on anti-Semitism, again, the dog whistles, or will say, oh, my best friends are Jews, or my children are Jews, and therefore I can't be anti-Semitic. I don't think, I would say President Trump is not an anti-Semite. He has anti-Semitic supporters who listen to certain things, and absolutely we saw this in 2016, 2017, 2018, really this increase in white nationalist groups who really believed they had a friend in the White House. At the same time, objectively, actually, the Trump administration has done more, at least with relationships with Israel, with moving the embassy, with some of these relationships with Arab countries, and we laud the administration actually for those achievements. And that executive order that you mentioned, that got a lot of criticism from Democrats and from those on the left. And it was actually ironic, because I'm reading this executive order on combating anti-Semitism. And for those on the audience who don't know the details, it was basically ensuring that under Title VI, which is our Civil Rights Code from 1964, which doesn't include religion, actually, that Jews would still be included as a protected group, not as a religious group, but kind of as a national origin group. And the Combating Antisemitism executive order encourages colleges and universities to use the IRA definition to understand what anti-Semitism is. The Democrats kind of went a little, they were very concerned with this definition. They pushed back, or this executive order, they pushed back against it. And the wording wasn't different from what our Department of Education used under the Obama administration. I served under the Obama administration for 4 years, and we actually were using that same language with our own work. So there was this, because it came from the Trump administration, it was almost deemed as muddied or wrong or bad. And the language was wonderful, actually, when I look at it and I read it. So that's something to think about. Actually, it's something to think about when we talk about politicization of even fighting anti-Semitism. The Biden administration, I think, will have I don't think they're going to renege the Abraham Accords. They're going to build off of them, which I think is important. AJC is actually advocating toward the Biden administration not to revoke that executive order that you mentioned, because it's a good executive order. And so we're saying that it should stay. I think when it comes to how anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist rhetoric, which actually can target Jews as Jews, and again, there's that line, we're going to have to push more on that specific space. But I think we're going to be much stronger in anti-Semitism coming from the far right and pushing back against white supremacy, pushing back against white nationalism, which really is the biggest threat to American Jews. Our survey showed that 89% of American Jews believe that the serious threats or 49% believe that the serious threats from the far right, with only 16% believing it was from the far left. So I think that's where we're going to be headed, but we will see, at least starting on January 20th.
Thank you. Our next question goes to Dr. Ran Porat.
Thank you, Holly, for a fascinating presentation so far. I'm interested in two aspects. One is the comparative aspect, because similar surveys actually running for like almost 30 years in Australia among Jews do indicate different levels of perceptions of anti-Semitism in Australia. The recent one in 2017 noted something anywhere between a quarter and a third of Australian Jews consider anti-Semitism in Australia to be big or fairly big. And I'm wondering if there's any comparison with the survey you mentioned. The other aspect I wanted you to talk about is the impact of COVID-19 in respect to the popularity of anti-Semitism and the types of anti-Semitism. By that, I mean, is it the classic one, the ancient one, where the Jews control the money, etc., or are there new types of stories and anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. So in answer to your first question about how big anti-Semitism is, the number was for American Jews, 9 in 10 believe that it was a problem, 37% that it was kind of a very big problem, and 88 or 82% believe that it had increased, and 43% believe that it increased a lot. And that number was almost half for both of the Americans, the US general public. It was basically kind of cut in half on both of them. So again, there is that lack between American Jews and the general public. COVID-19 has been very interesting to see anti-Semitism change. I started this role, so I focus, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I'm the AJC's US director for combating anti-Semitism, so I'm only focusing on anti-Semitism in the United States. Of course, with the internet, I mean, and just in general, it's a global problem. But I started this role on April 20th, so right during the pandemic, and immediately was going into what's happening online and especially with COVID-19. We've seen a lot of the same tropes recycled with, kind of COVID, whether it be a COVID language, whether it be like, Jews wanting to create, Jews created the virus in order to profit off the vaccine. So again, using that profiting thing, profiting trope, or again, hearkening back to Jews being blamed for the plague, that Jews have the coronavirus, they're purposefully spreading it. Just again, that the trope of poisoning the well, right? Which goes back to, again, to like the 14th century. We saw that again. A lot of memes that were created, especially the smirking merchant meme, which is a stereotypical like Jewish figure, like, rubbing his hands together, stereotypical facial features, with different coronavirus related, paraphernalia, whether they're, passing it along, coughing on purpose. So basically the material and the fodder was all there. And it's just being recycled in this present context. And it was connected to Israel, the idea of pushing COVID-19 to Israel, give it, these kinds of memes as well. There have been a new term, for instance, a new anti-Semitic trope that came out of COVID-19 in particular was something called the Holocaust. Again, it was came off of an individual that started actually on Gab, which is a kind of an online messaging platform, which is basically like, if I'm trying to think what it said, if you have a bug, give a Jew a hug, or if you something like that, or pass the flu to every Jew. And it was this coronavirus, but it was making fun of the Holocaust and connecting it with cough. And that was a completely new meme that just came out of COVID-19. So, and then the methods, that's new a little bit too. Zoom bombing really wasn't necessarily a thing. We've seen hacking of websites, but because there's so many students and so many Jews online, specific targets in ways that we haven't really seen before. Even yesterday, we had North Shore Hebrew Academy in Long Island, New York. Their entire school website was hacked with anti-Semitic, with images, with Adolf Hitler, with everything was changed. The students' personal information was actually taken. It's horrific. So we're seeing an increase of online anti-Semitism unfortunately, because of COVID.
Thank you. Now, there've been a series of questions that have been sent in, and we're not going to be able to get through all of them by any means, but I'm going to ask you a series and try and get some quick answers where possible. First one is, Omar Barghouti, the co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, has said the Jews are not a people, that they did not suffer in Arab countries, and that there is no place for a Jewish state anywhere in the territory of Palestine or that area. Contrary to how it is often depicted, BDS is not a movement for improving the lives of Palestinians. How can the anti-Semitism underlying BDS be better exposed or publicized?
Absolutely. So we actually asked that question in our survey, and I didn't show the slide for it, but we asked Americans and American Jews if they think the BDS movement is either anti-Semitic or has anti-Semitic supporters. And first we asked if they knew about the movement. And thankfully, I think it's actually a good thing that the majority of Americans don't know about BDS. That's actually, I think that's a good thing. But those who did know about it, I think the number was 60% actually said that it was anti-Semitic or had anti-Semitic supporters. That number is much higher in the Jewish community. But we have to do just what you just said. We actually have to expose the origins. It's especially hard. We have a campus affairs department at AJC, and it's on campus where many students, non-Jewish students, Jewish students are involved with these, these human rights, social justice movements, and it sounds good on the surface. And that's where we have to kind of share what the founders actually said, and how this is anti-Jewish actually in these ways, or it would at least manifest itself in that way. And I think we've actually had some anti-BDS resolutions passed not only at the state college level, or the state level in our different states legislatures, but actually at some colleges now. But it's something that we're going to continue to push forward. Thank you.
The next is about the diverse obstacles to your work. The question is, and there are a number of questions which are not necessarily linked, but the answer might be. One, when you have Jewish organizations participating in events with anti-Semites on the subject, such as a recent event with Jewish Voice for Peace. Then you have a situation of one of the main drafters of the IHRA declaration being one of the people calling for those to be very cautious with how it is used. Now, I know Ken Stern extremely well. We're very close friends, and I know that he is not against using the IHRA definition, but is concerned a little bit about some of the ways it has been used. But these are potential obstacles to your work, and of course there are people who push back anyway. So could you explain briefly the Jewish part of the problem in pushback against your work, but also the other major obstacles you're encountering?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the major obstacle I'm encountering is just the kind of the overwhelming, just like long-standing nature of the problem, the bigness of the problem, the complex nature of the problem, and it's just, you know, how do you feel like everything that you do is just a drop. But Ira Foreman, who I used to work for, and Jeremy, when we met, we was with Special Envoy Foreman, used to say that, you know, we're never going to turn the faucet of anti-Semitism off, but, you know, how can we turn those levels down? And I think about that with these obstacles. Specifically, I think you were referencing, there was a talk, I think it was yesterday, with Rashida Tlaib and Peter Beinart, and kind of discussing anti-Semitism and disassociating actually anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism. So that is, you know, one voice. We always kind of counter that by saying that there is 10% of American Jews that are very loudly maybe anti-Zionist, or maybe saying there's no connection between the two, but the majority of American Jews, which is, you want to listen to the majority when understanding a problem, say that there is a connection. And of course, this doesn't, you know, I always talk about the Hasidic community, the Satmar community in Brooklyn, who are anti-Zionists for religious reasons. Like, they're not anti-Semites. I don't use the IRA definition against them. That's something that we get sometimes. With Ken Stern, you know, he actually used to have my job in some way before I started, but he was focused mostly on college campuses. But he really was AJC's, you know, US person to work on anti-Semitism in the United States. He did contribute to the drafting of not the IRA definition, actually, which is funny. They get it a little wrong. It was a previous definition going toward the European Union Monitoring Center, or the EUMC. It was a predecessor of IRA. And he helped edit it. And I think he has every right to talk about how he thinks it should be used, but he wasn't the lead drafter. He was, you know, one of many other AJC, but others around the world. And I think we have to bring in other voices that talk about, and non-Jewish voices, actually. I think that's so important. And non-Jewish voices, European government leaders in Sweden and Spain, which are so much further left than our democratic leaders, and who still have, you know, who've adopted the IRA definition and still have very tough policies toward Israel. And they talk about why they've adopted the definition. And they're much even further to the left than some of these folks who are arguing that. And those are the people that we need to use to elevate the definition. But last thing I'll say, Jeremy, and it can be so easy to get tied up in these kind of arguments about this panel and who's speaking on it, and you know, what someone's saying about the IRA definition. And there was this whole spat with me this summer about, we had a former Democratic presidential, actually, or nominee, Howard Dean, who had made some pretty bad comments about me fighting anti-Semitism. And for those on this call who don't know, I'm actually not Jewish. I am, and so basically, non-Jews can't fight anti-Semitism was the accusation, and there was a lot of hullabaloo around it. It's like so much so that for like 2 weeks, that's what people were focusing on, and I kept saying, the anti-Semites are winning when we're focusing on these like internal battles. Like we have to look at the big picture again. And so I think that's what I always try to do, is even with these things, which I don't like, I kind of grimace when I see these kinds of things. It's just, again, focusing on the long game.
Thank you. And obviously the people in this call were interested enough to send in those questions. So it's reached here, that discussion. But the last question I'm going to put to you relates to the United Nations. Now, next year is the 20th anniversary of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, which I was an Australian government delegate, as well as a World Jewish Congress representative. It was after that we had a lot of the discussions about definitions and what we can do. But, and I was one of those international experts involved in the drafting that you've been speaking about. So I know the process very well. But one of the big problems was, prior to that World Conference Against Racism, there were many people with the idea that the UN were almost like the Jedi Knights. They were going to be part of the solution and turned out to be part of the problem. And there are many observations about what happens within the UN, providing platforms in different ways to anti-Semitism, a place where countries which might do the right thing in IRA do the wrong thing when they get into the UN environment. So my question, or a combination of questions that have been sent in, also relates to the question of what can be done, if anything, within the UN context. And the second question, which again relates to the Durban experience. After Durban, or an observation many Jewish groups made at that conference, was that there was a cost for being against anti-Semitism and no cost for being anti-Semitic. And we thought it was very important you flip that. Could you outline how you see it going? Is there now a cost for being anti-Semitism? Do people have to suffer the consequences of promoting this particularly pernicious form of racism?
Those are really important questions, Jeremy, and I wish we had more time. You know what, the UN, I think, is going to be the last domino to fall. It's the sum of its parts. It's has a lot of issues and a lot of problems. It can do a lot of great things too. I mean, even when we look to this phrase that's used all the time now, unfortunately, on social media to attack Jews, that Zionism is racism. You know, that really did have its origins in the United Nations in that 1975 resolution. So there's been a lot of issues that have come out of the UN. I'm hopeful. It's still gonna, there's still gonna be other things that are gonna have to happen. And I think even the peace that we're seeing now, or at least more of a warm peace between Israel and Morocco and the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Bhutan, like, I mean, this is going to, I hope, slowly trickle into the UN, but it's gonna be years and years. But sometimes we get asked, we should just remove ourselves from UN processes, from, you know, the UN Security Council, you know, we should, and my argument is no, we should stay in. We need to be part of the conversations, be part of it, getting to that place. I've been really pleasantly pleased by the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, who actually came out. He was supposed to write a paper on freedom of religion. He spent the entire paper talking about combating anti-Semitism and talking about the need for the IHRA definition to be adopted and used. And more, I think more recently, actually, the UN General Secretary Guterres also recommended the IHRA definition for use. So, I mean, these are just people. Again, it's the sum of its parts, and it's gonna take a long time, but we are seeing improvement from what we were seeing again in 1975. So that's one thing. Great question about cost. Is there a cost? Is there a consequence for being anti-Semitic? You know, we talk about, one thing we're criticized a lot in the United States is our First Amendment, that we have this First Amendment, you can say the most odious anti-Semitic thing possible, and it's okay. And we talk about civil society mechanisms of pushback, that, you know, you're ostracized. There is a social cost that if you say something anti-Semitic and you are Nick Cannon, for instance, you lose your job. Like, there needs to be that social cost until you can show that you've learned, or that you're better, or that you apologize, or whatever it is, for us to really be successful. And I think one of my fears, and this is kind of where I'll end, because that cost has to be there, Jeremy, and I don't know to the extent that it is that when we overuse the word anti-Semitism, and for instance, like when we, like even the Trump administration with calling some of these, actually, and their policies were a little objectionable, but some NGOs anti-Semitic. I think that kind of lowers the bar of like what anti-Semitism really is. And people are like, oh, well, they're not anti-Semitic, so that there's no cost there. So I think we do have to be really careful and make sure that that weight's there, and that we don't overuse the term as well. And I know that's a strong, hard balance to strike. But.
Well, thank you so much. As you said, we needed another 1 to 3 hours to get through everything, but we're very grateful for the time you've given us today.